Oh my god, these weeks go by so fast. Hey everyone, thank you for downloading The Retro Gamers. Larry here.
And Anthony here.
What's up, Ant? Another week goes by and we're back.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing how quickly a week goes by. I feel like, we just recorded the other one 10 minutes ago.
It feels just like that. And I did this on purpose, I guess I'll say. We left a cliffhanger from last week as far as we were talking...
Wait. We do that?
We do. Now we do. Yes, I'm not talking about
okay.
Cliffhanger the game. I'm talking based on the movie, but a cliffhanger. Basically, we were talking, you of course talking about the expo, the SoCal Expo, and that you texted me Stack Up, which someone was selling for a ridiculous amount, $550. I mentioned that Stack Up and Gyromite had alternate start screens when you put them in, and of course I left you folks an entire week to wonder what it's all about, even though I didn't tell you. So long story short, Gyromite booted up as Robot Gyro, or I guess Robot Gyro if you're off the boat, and Stack Up was Robot Block.
Oh,
so there you go. It's been bugging me all week.
Sorry that was bugging you all week. I didn't give it a single thought after our podcast was over.
I always do. And we're going to start the show as we do every show as well. You get a chance to pop in Shining Force 2? I know you had a busy week.
It was... The week's been crazy. It's Labor Day weekend. I just... I'm in the middle of an ice hockey tournament.
There you go.
So I've been spending most of my time on the ice and not in front of the video games. I will say that I did turn it on briefly to try. And if you remember what I talked about last week, I'm trying to upgrade my weapons in this little dwarven town with Mithril, but it gives you random weapons.
Yeah, you didn't like that.
Right? No, I don't like that at all. I just want the ultra rare weapons that do the most damage. I mean, is that so much to ask after playing this game for weeks and weeks and weeks? No,
possibly
not at all. But of course, they have it as a random generator, so 75% of the time or 80% of the time, I'm getting these crappy common weapons that I already own. And I'm like, well, what's the point of having Mithril and upgrading your weapons if you're getting the same common weapons you've already purchased? So I spent a little bit of time trying to upgrade my weapons. I have not been successful, and I am determined not to move on until I get the ultra rare weapons that I want. So basically, I turned the game on and I kept resetting it and resetting it and resetting it and resetting it. I still don't have my weapons, so it's going to have to wait for another day.
Oh well. Well, we'll check it out next week. And speaking of weapons, we actually have. Can we name this person our number one fan? Is he our only fan? I don't know.
I think it's official, considering the fact that he called me and told me that he listens to every episode.
He texted me, said the same thing.
Yeah, he said he listens to every episode. He thinks that the stuff we talk about is great, which means he's either high on paint fumes or he doesn't have much to do with his free time. Seriously, though, no. Great guy, great person, big fan of the show, and it's always nice to actually admit that we have somebody who's a big fan of the show. It's a little humbling, isn't it?
A little bit, yes. Very much so.
So, our good pal Frankie Messina, also known as Bald Frankie. Our own Professor X minus the powers. But so he had reached out to both of us individually, requesting that we do a podcast with a specific theme, and he wanted to hear us talk about superhero video games.
There we go. Why not?
And so we have decided to honor his request. So Frankie, this podcast is directly associated with you.
All the way to number one. And you know what? With the superheroes, that really ties in, because let's face facts. In our group, when we were, way back when, even though I wasn't as much into them, comic books was the center of a lot of what we did when we were hanging out and growing up. So the comic books led to the board games led to the video games. But, it all started with the superheroes and with comic books.
Yeah, I mean comic book superheroes have been around since you go back to Superman in the early 30s, or even before him. But superheroes have been around for a really long time. Obviously now, in 2016 they're ridiculously mainstream thanks to the success of all the films that have come out, or the pseudo successes with certain films.
Different.
We won't name them. We won't name them at all. DC. So. Yeah, so now that it is mainstream and superheroes are cool, it's this is the perfect time to talk about superhero video games in the retro world when back then it was more of a niche market.
Yeah, it pretty much was. Yeah, no one admitted that they were comic book fans, or probably let alone started playing these games. But they started early.
Because you got beat up by the kids who played baseball and football.
Pretty much, yeah, that happened often, at least to me.
You stand alone on that one.
We didn't even have a football team. That was what was weird. So,
yeah, I remember.
And this is going to be a little bit lopsided because we were talking before we started recording here, just to kind of get kind of see what games were available and stuff. And Marvel just blew the doors down as far as flooding the market with games. Where
no question,
DC, they had their games, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But Marvel really jumped on it with this.
Well, and it's entirely possible that it just could have been the their strategy in regard the company's strategy, Marvel and DC. Mm-hmm. DC just may not have seen any lucrative field in terms of video games, especially because when you got to remember the Atari crash of the early 80s.
Yeah.
Or the mid 80s. When Atari crashed, a lot of people got out of the video game realm because they didn't think it was going to recover. And even though Nintendo came around, and blew the doors off of it, some companies were still very, gun shy. Mm-hmm. And it could very well be that DC was one of them because there were, a couple of DC games on the Atari. On those, on that early system, and then they went quiet for a little while.
They sure did, and I think we'll get into that one real quick. I mean, Atari really the first system for a lot of us, and who can forget that epic Spider-Man video game on Atari?
Oh man, that Spider-Man game was awesome. I remember the cover of the game because it's
yes.
It was it was at this interesting angle of Spider-Man looking at the building, and the Green Goblin is circling around on top, trying, throwing a bomb at him, and again, and I talked about this last week.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. Exactly. You mentioned
cover art sold Atari games.
Yep.
All those old games, because the graphics were so simple. They sold them by cover art, and granted, having a licensed product like mm-hmm. Spider-Man, I'm sure helped it out a lot, because when you turned the game on and played it, it's kind of cheesy.
Yeah, it was basically you had to get to the top of a building, and now you got to remember, really the only graphics were the blue background of the sky, the beige or whatever color you want of the building, and everything looks hollow in the building, and then there's Spider-Man, and you just slowly ascending, shooting the webbing, ascending up every once in a while. Well, when you got to the top, the Green Lantern, what? The Green Goblin, he would start fire up on top, and I remember once you get to the top, there was an antenna at the top of the building, and I remember having the hardest time trying to latch on to that antenna.
Yeah, it was ridiculously hard, and and you had, and just climbing up, it was a challenge in and of itself, because you had to stay out of the way of, what the Green Goblin was shooting at you, and you would try and use your web to swing across, and, again, because it was like, the graphics were so simple, and it was buggy, and I remember playing the game where half the time, like Spider-Man, you'd be climbing up the building, and he would disappear off the screen for a minute, and I'm like, wait, where did he go? And then he comes back, and I'm like, oh, there's my little red and blue dot, or red and blue figure-looking thing.
Yeah, and then I think it was if you shot into the window, I think you started falling as well.
Yes, and you would have to catch yourself, and if you didn't catch yourself, you went splat on the pavement, and that was the end of Spider-Man.
In my head, I remember the noise. I can't reproduce it verbally. I just remember the noise, just the gameplay, the sound, especially falling, and which happened often when I was doing it.
I know the sound on that. I mean, because again, all the sound was at the time was like, beeps and boops, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. That's exactly it.
And it's just, I'm trying to see if I can bring it up just so we can hear it for a second.
Yeah, and I'm trying to find, I remember seeing
Hold on.
something.
Hold on one second. I think I have it right here. Nope, I have some idiot talking about it.
And we already have 2 idiots talking about it right now. We don't need a third one.
Yeah, I was just going to say 2 is enough. Thank you very much. Wait, why are people reviewing the game on... Okay, wait, hold on. Let's see if I can find it.
Yeah, they're doing what we're doing. We're talking about a visual medium where they're actually showing it. That's what I keep trying to look up. Because there's another... When I was at my virtual video game.
Can you hear that?
No.
You can't hear this?
Barely.
Oh, well.
The people at home, they've tuned out.
Oh, well. Well, never mind. That was my first attempt at using sound on this show.
Nothing like testing it on the fly, folks.
You know what? That's what we do.
Exactly.
We're not professional here.
No, professional. What? No way. All right, I got to go to my YouTube page to pull up that stupid video then that I did. Because there was a game... Well, first of all, before we leave the topic of Spider-Man on Atari 2600, Parker Brothers. You know, who knew Parker Brothers, mostly a board game company, published a video game back in 82?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where they were trying to get into this new medium. You know, video games all of a sudden was super hot. Atari was selling really well. You had ColecoVision. You had Intellivision. So they decided to take a chance, and they are the ones who actually created the Spider-Man game.
Yeah, and it worked out, in my opinion, real well. I remember when I was at my... Because I had
that wasn't the only game that they did, right?
Parker Brothers?
No, they also did Frogger, Q*bert, and the Star Wars games.
They published all those on Atari?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
They produced those.
Really?
I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, because a company like Parker Brothers, who had been making, board games for a long period of time, they went out and they licensed other, properties and then made video games out of them.
Guess it makes sense now. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. Oh, okay.
Yep.
Who did I think made that? Oh, okay, cool. No, hey, learn something new every day.
And I'm happy to be the one to teach you since you don't know anything.
Thank you very much. There was a game when I went the Retro Gaming Expo I went to earlier in the in August. There was a game there, Dr. Doom's Revenge, and now that we're talking about it, I'm trying to remember what exactly it was for the PC, I believe.
It was for the Commodore. It was like for the Commodore and the Amiga. And it was Spider-Man and Captain America in Dr. Doom's Revenge.
Yep. Oh, here it is. Got it. Yep, I'm looking at it right here finally. Yeah, because I remember looking at the box. I thought it was like a make-your-own comic book. But no, clearly a crossover game, actually. Probably, dare I say, the first crossover game I'm looking at here for Marvel.
Is it technically a crossover game, though, when you think about it?
Boy.
Because it's just 2 characters in the Marvel universe. I would say a crossover game would be something a little bit bigger.
Like Battletoads Double Dragon?
Yes. Like
You're
those
right.
are real crossover games.
You're right. I guess that's another topic.
And
for
actually,
another time.
now that you bring that up too, I remember since you brought up the Commodore 64 game, I remember the Hulk Commodore 64 game because I owned it.
That one. Oh yeah,
and that was one of those games where it was text. You know how the text adventure games used to be?
Yes.
Where they would tell you this is a situation, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
And I had the Hulk game, and I don't remember where I got it from or if my dad bought it for me or whatever, but like I just remember the Hulk game because I only got through the first like 2 or 3 screens, and then I didn't know what to do after that. So I never really went beyond it because what happens is the game starts up, and the cool thing about it is that it actually had images. Like this was a text-based game, but it had images because they would use the pixels to at least draw some type of image on the screen. So I remember the game starting up, and it's Bruce Banner in a room, and he's tied to a chair. And that's literally where the game starts. There's a text, and it says, you're tied to a chair. What do you do? And then you put the command in, and you're trying to do things, and it's like, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, whatever. And then eventually, what you would do is you would, if you came up with a command to tip the chair over. When you tip the chair over, you hit something and some gas came in the room or something like that, and then all of a sudden you got angry and turned into the Hulk and you burst out of the chair. And then after that, like I would, you punch the door and you leave or whatever it is, and then after that I had no idea what to do.
And
I was always able to get out of the chair, but that's as far as I got.
And that was a trilogy on the Commodore. I'm looking, Quest Probe. It was called Quest Probe, featuring Hulk, Spider-Man, and then Human Torch and the Thing.
Yeah, so one of these days I would love to go back to that game just to play through it and see if I can figure it out now, because now I'm no longer 7, so I might actually have the mental capacity to get through this game.
Possibly. Now there was moving on from Spider-Man. Spider-Man really didn't debut on the NES till much later. The X-Men, actually the first game to be on the NES. Excuse me, the Uncanny X-Men. Let me be specific.
Yes,
so
and that game was an absolute disaster.
Yeah, they weren't good.
Well, first off, it was produced by LJN, and if you know anything about retro gaming, any game produced by LJN, for the most part, was going to be absolute crap. They did not, honestly, no. I mean, if you look at the majority of the games, they really did not put much care into the games. They just really wanted, they wanted to make money. And you play that Uncanny X-Men game. There were 6 characters in it. You chose 2 per level when you went on the level. One was controlled by you, and if you didn't have a friend with you, the other one was controlled by the computer.
Who had no idea what they were doing. The computer was horrible.
Had no idea what they were doing. And basically, you're walking through this board, and you can't even figure out what's going on the board because it was just a pixelated mess.
It's a top-down view, too. You got to imagine, like, from Super C, like the second and I think 5th level, whatever, was a top-down view. That's the entire game. And of the 6, there was 2 shooters, 2, like, melee characters, 2 shooter characters. I forgot what the other 2 were. Well, maybe there was 3 and 3 actually. Maybe.
Well, there were two flyers. I think you would call them flyers, like because you had Storm, who used to like fly and shoot. You had Iceman, who would slide and shoot, and then you had Cyclops, and you had Nightcrawler, who would teleport, and you had Wolverine, and then I'm forgetting the last one, Colossus, and you had Colossus, who was a puncher.
They were the 3 melees, yeah.
Yeah, so you had 3 melees and three shooters, basically. Yep. But the board looked so awful. You could not figure out where you were supposed to go.
Oh, it's terrible.
And then, and you didn't realize what things did damage to you, so you were just walking on the board, and all of a sudden your character would die, and you have no idea why. Or you would just be punching at thin air, hoping to do damage to things, or shooting things, hoping to do damage to things. There was no reason to ever play that game.
And of course, true to the comic books, where a lot of X-Men games followed suit. Wolverine, when his adamantium claws were out, he would lose power. He would get hurt. Which doesn't make sense.
No sense whatsoever.
Also, in theory, if you have a Wolverine game, because of his rejuvenation powers, he shouldn't die. It should be the easiest game in the world.
Right. You should be able to just basically walk through the game, take all the bullets, and win.
Exactly. But of course, we'll get into the Wolverine game coming up later. Yes. That was X-Men for NES. Then they had Silver Surfer for NES, which was just, it was
a complete disaster.
It was a shoot 'em up, not a shoot 'em up, but it was almost like Gradius, like a side-scrolling shooter.
Side-scrolling. And it wasn't very good.
One hit, and that was it.
Yep. I will say this though, for I know a majority of what we're talking about here is Marvel. But to switch over to DC, the Batman NES game was pretty good.
Batman NES game, based on the movie, was probably on the NES, probably the best superhero game.
Badass. Yeah.
Game rocked.
Yep.
We can spend a whole show talking about that game. There was only 5 levels. The graphics were phenomenal. Sunsoft made it. The music was on par. The cutscenes for the NES were I constantly, the one that always sticks out in my mind is the scene of the Batmobile driving into the chemical warehouse and fires the guns and creates the door, if you will, which they recreated for the NES fantastically. And the villains were, as the game progressed, got harder and harder. And the Joker, once you got the Joker down, you're able to figure out his patterns. But just overall, as you can see, I could talk about it forever.
Yeah, no, I have nothing but high praise for that game also. If you've never, anybody listening, if you've never played Batman for NES, it's definitely a game to pick up and try. Or just find it somewhere and watch it, or whatever you want to do. But it was definitely one of the. No, if you're into retro gaming, if you're listening to us and into retro gaming,
totally.
Yeah, definitely a great game to play.
I remember when I was at not just NES, Genesis had its fair share of superhero games. I don't remember with the Sega. I mean, I had a Sega CD, but it's weird. I don't remember many of the superhero games on Sega CD, like Amazing Spider-Man versus Kingpin, or well, I do remember Batman. Batman Returns was on Sega CD. I do remember that.
Yeah, Batman Returns and The Adventures of Batman and Robin was also on Sega CD.
Yeah, and that if I knew that, I would have gotten that. I had it on Super Nintendo, but even though I think the Genesis one was a little bit better, we'll get into that in a moment. When I was at my retro gaming expo out here on Long Island, I remember I saw Captain America and the Avengers, which came out on everything.
Oh yeah,
so
that one was actually an arcade game.
Yes,
that they ported over to Super Nintendo, and actually they ported it to the NES as well. But I owned, and I may still own, the Super Nintendo version of that game, and I loved that game. That game to me was like the precursor to the X-Men arcade game, which was far superior.
That game,
probably one of my favorite arcade games of all time. And thankfully, when they offered that on the 360,
yes,
you're able to download that. I was like, I bought that day one.
Xbox,
but Captain America and the Avengers, I feel like they set the stage for that one.
Oh, it really did. And then moving right along, Spider-Man came back. Spider-Man and the X-Men. I don't know if you want to consider that one a crossover. Arcade's Revenge. That game was phenomenal.
I love that game, and to this day I still haven't beat that game.
Yep. Spider-Man.
Storm's stupid water level. I can't get out of it without drowning.
Well, you know what happens to it. You know what happens to a toad when struck by lightning, right?
Oh, jeez.
Same thing that happens to everything else.
And that's why she drowned.
Spider-Man: Return of the Sinister Six was one of the few games I had for Game Gear. That was I mean, that was on Nintendo Master System, NES Master System, and Game Gear. So
I never played that one.
That was good. I got to go back. I think back at my parents' house, I think my one of the few things that survived when Hurricane Sandy decided to blow in and get rid of a lot of my stuff, I think was some of the games. I lost the Game Gear, but I think I can get my hands on a Game Gear. I got to check with my sources.
Cool. I saw a lot of Game Gears last week at the expo.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah. And Game Gear was the only handheld system I ever owned. I never owned a Game Boy.
It was great. Game Boy is awesome. And I didn't own superhero games on Game Boy. I did own Super Nintendo. This is what we're going to get into now, because I remember myself, I got into, like I said, growing up, I really wasn't into superheroes, comic books. It really wasn't that I started hanging out with you guys is when I started learning about the genre. And on Super Nintendo, first of all, probably one of my favorite games of all time, Spider-Man Maximum Carnage.
Oh, man, that game is amazing.
Super Nintendo, Genesis. I remember it was a red cartridge, which back then was like, whoa, it's a red cartridge. That's sweet. But the game was just, if you had to describe it, it was Final Fight with Spider-Man.
Yeah, and not only that, it felt like you were walking through a comic book.
Yes.
Like, the graphics made it look like you were playing in a comic book. Yep. And the coolest thing about Maximum Carnage, because Maximum Carnage was it was a series. It was a comic book series. I forgot how many issues it was. I don't know if it was 10 or 12 issues, but it was like a 10 or 12-part series. Maybe it was less. I don't know. But it was a multiple-part series, and it brought in all these other characters from other comic books, other Marvel books, because like Cloak and Dagger was a part of that series, and I forget who else was involved in it. There were a few other people who popped up throughout it, and that's what made the series the miniseries so interesting. And then the fact that they ported that into a video game and included all of that story, it just made for such an amazing experience.
You'll probably know it better than I did. When that game came out, did Carnage, because that character, let's face facts, I don't really remember much of that character after the game. I don't remember him before the game. But that time, that year when that game came out, Carnage was all over the place.
Well, because Carnage at the time was a new character. Carnage was created, if I remember correctly, probably in 91, I think. Yeah, 1991. So this was like at the height of Spider-Man's popularity. He was huge at the time, and Venom had been out for a while, and then here comes Carnage, and Carnage was just absolutely vicious. And no, seriously. He was. He comes
nasty.
in and he just goes to town. I mean, and if I remember correctly, like one of the first things he does is in Maximum Carnage, I believe he killed Dagger of Cloak and Dagger, and now Cloak and Dagger had been around for a very long time. And and granted, how comic books are, the superheroes never stay dead.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? It's like he made an immediate impact, and like to think all the years that everybody watched Venom do what he did, Carnage came in and just ripped the hell out of it.
Yeah, and
it was insane.
I called it Spider-Man Max. It's Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage. So Venom, I don't know why I forget. I keep thinking he's in the second game, but Venom was in this as well, and introduced again to a casual comic book person like me, introduced Venom to this world as well. So, but that game again, that was, in my opinion, one of the best Super Nintendo. I didn't play it on Genesis. I had it on Super Nintendo games that was out there for Spider-Man.
Yep.
And then the sequel, or I guess pseudo sequel, would be Separation Anxiety, Spider-Man Venom, Separation Anxiety, which pretty much played the same. Not as good as Maximum Carnage, but still a good game into itself.
Oh yeah, Separation Anxiety, and the story for Separation Anxiety I don't think was as powerful. That's why, because Maximum Carnage was such a really strong story. Separation Anxiety, again, great game. Just as good as I felt like it was just as good as the Maximum Carnage one. But yeah, just to me, it was a sequel.
Now let's going back. This may be a two-parter because we're going to talk a lot about Marvel here. We may get to DC next time. X-Men 2: Clone Wars for Genesis.
Well, X-Men 1 and X-Men 2 for Genesis.
True, but I feel like X-Men 2: Clone Wars. Children of the Atom. That was the first one, right? X-Men, and then.
Yeah, no.
No.
More of an arcade. I want to say it was more of an arcade fighter.
Yeah.
X-Men and X-Men 2 came out before Children of the Atom, but X-Men and X-Men 2. The first one was a bit hard to control the characters, and there weren't that many. You only got to control 4 characters.
And this is on Genesis. So.
And this is on Genesis. Yeah. It was not on any other system.
No.
You got to control 4 characters, but then there were 5 other characters that you can call on to help you. And the game was fun. 4 of my favorite characters from X-Men were the ones you actually played, which is why I liked it so much. It was Gambit, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, and Cyclops. Great game. But then X-Men 2 Clone Wars, I feel like really stepped it up because you got to play, not only did you get to play with more characters, you got to play as Magneto. And Magneto was such a huge character to play with. You also had, I think for the first time ever, you were able to play with a female character, which was Psylocke.
Yeah. Well, Storm.
So, Storm wasn't playable in the first X-Men. She was just there to help you.
Gotcha.
Yeah, like Storm, Rogue, and Jean Grey were in the game, but you just called on them to help you, and they would do one thing and leave.
And the fun part about X-Men 2 Clone Wars, as soon as you boot up the game, you're playing. There's no opening sequence. There's no menu. You're in the game, and it's random every time that you start it up.
Yeah, it literally, all of a sudden, you wake up, you open it up. It's the same level, but like when you start the game, it's a different character. And then you have to get through that level first before you even get to the opening screen.
To the game, yeah. I mentioned Children of the Atom. I apologize. I don't know why I thought Children of the Atom was a fighter, and
yep, I still have it.
An excellent fighting game, yes.
Yeah, Children of the Atom, I still have the PC disc for it.
And that actually led to some of the greatest fighting games, like Street Fighter type games. I mean, Marvel superheroes, of course, the big one, well, X-Men versus Street Fighter is what started it, but then Marvel versus Capcom is what really... took off.
Well, not even that. Yeah, I mean, it really took off. But Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
That was...
probably goes down in history as one of the best fighter games ever made.
Totally. I had a port of it on PlayStation. The arcade, correct me if I'm wrong, 3-on-3.
Yeah.
The PlayStation version, 2-on-2, but still, graphically, I mean, it held
amazing.
up. with the arcade, and that was hit right around when I was when we were in college. I dormed, and I nights upon nights of tournaments. Marvel's Capcom 2 tournaments on PlayStation was ridiculous.
Oh, and by the way, if anybody out there has a copy of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on Dreamcast, do not let it go.
Oh, yeah.
It is hard to find, and it's expensive to buy. But like, I regret the fact that I never had that on Dreamcast because I would still own it.
Oh, forget about it. I mean, that's got to be one of the top 2 like most expensive sought after games besides Shining Force 3 on Saturn, Sega Saturn.
Shining Force 3 is like impossible to find.
But no, not Sega Saturn. Sega CD.
No, Sega CD.
Yeah, Sega CD. So
Sega CD.
Yeah, but Marvel's Capcom 2, phenomenal. And then there was they cycled every single.
Yeah, and they had a slew of other games that were like here and there, hit or misses, like X-Men Mutant Academy, which was kind of like they made it movie based. They made it kind of look like the movie, and those games I thought were a miss. They made 2 of those.
Yeah, there was. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I know they made an Incredible Hulk game on PlayStation where it wasn't all that good.
The Fantastic Four games weren't very good either.
Iron Man and Exo Man-O-War and Heavy Metal, not as bad, I'm going to say. Maybe not the best in the world, but I think it was a little bit better on Game Boy than it was on PlayStation. But Spider-Man, when that came out on PlayStation, Spider-Man based on the comics, not necessarily the movie, because that didn't come out till later. That Spider-Man on PlayStation was fantastic. And I will even admit, now today I think completely different about it, but that was probably one of the first bootleg PlayStation games I had purchased. Long story short,
you admit it.
I do. For a while I was bootlegging.
The cops.
I admit. In college,
you're arrested.
In college, in the university center, they would always have someone, just set up a table and start selling stuff. And this one woman was selling, I remember, like, bootleg games. And back then, remember, a PlayStation game, you just simply just ripped it to another disc. That's how easy it was to copy, even though it had the black bottom. That I had to buy. I don't know if you remember. We'll talk about this next time. Just how to bootleg the PlayStation. We'll get into that next time. But I had to buy a thing, put it in the back of it.
I don't know if we're allowed to talk about that.
Well, that's all right. Statutes of limitations are going on that one. But yeah, Spider-Man I played endlessly in college. 2, it was all right, but Spider-Man 1, fantastic.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, when the movie game came out on PlayStation 2, I mean, I think I still own it too. I mean, I thought that was actually a pretty good game too.
Oh no, that wasn't bad either. I mean, it's the movie versus the cartoon, the comic book. I mean, and what I liked about the PlayStation, the one I'm talking about, Spider-Man, Stan Lee narrates the whole thing. So it's probably the first time he was in a video game.
That's right. I remember that.
So, and then we move on. We're getting a little bit closer here with more of the updated systems. X-Men Legends.
X-Men Legends was probably
great game.
One of my favorite games to play through. And then X-Men Legends 2, when you actually got to play as some of the villains on your team also.
Yes, Rise of Apocalypse.
Those 2 games were just outstanding. Absolutely love both of them.
They were great. They were RPGs. So basically they were RPGs. Almost like, I know we talk about it sometimes in jest, but almost like Shining Force. Like you move one character at a time and then... Right? If I remember correctly?
No.
It's been a while since I played.
X-Men Legends played like Marvel Ultimate Alliance, where you had 4 characters on the screen at once.
Oh, that's right.
You can control one and switch to the other. See, the cool thing that was about those games is you finally felt like you were playing with a team. Mm-hmm. So for example, with X-Men Legends, I remember you had like 15 different characters or 16 different characters you can play with. You were playing with, you can choose between Cyclops and Beast and Colossus and Gambit and Jean Grey and Jubilee and Wolverine. It's like, you can just swap. And as you're playing through a level, if I remember correctly, when you got to a save point, you were able to switch your team up. So you were constantly switching teams. So it felt like you were in the comic book with the team, and you're playing with the team, and that's what was so fun about it.
And you mentioned also Marvel Ultimate Alliance and Ultimate Alliance 2, which they just re-released on PS4 and Xbox One with souped-up graphics, but those were originally on 360 and PS3, so it's a little bit, moving up a little bit more outside of retro gaming, but that was like at the tail end, in my opinion, of like where everything started crossing over, at least in our opinions. Yeah. But that probably, if you want to talk about one of the last best games in that old school era, it's probably going to be X-Men Legends, on Xbox. So.
Yeah, I think so, because then that's when everything, obviously then we get into more, current games, and that's not what we talk about.
So it was a rocky...
We have a line and it needs to be drawn.
Yes, and that's what we're going to draw here, because quite honestly, Marvel goes on forever. DC had their fair share of games, which I think we'll talk about next week. But Marvel their games started off rocky, got, a little wacky there for a while, but as time went on, they definitely picked up steam and, really finally found their niche, in my opinion.
Yep. Now I really want to go back and play X-Men, the arcade game again.
So, love that game. Remember the board game? The X-Men board game we played?
But I had both of the board games. There were two.
The one we used to play for 7 hours.
Yeah, and you remember they had little plastic figures. They had like 24 little plastic figures, and I painted them. I painted them.
I didn't remember that part.
Because at that time I was still painting little pewter figures for D&D. Because yes, I'm a loser, but
hey, D&D rocks.
Yeah, I love D&D. But, I painted all the plastic figures to look like the characters because it was just awesome to do that.
God, we played that game, and I don't know why it took so long.
Endlessly.
I mean, literally, I'm not even joking, people. 6 or 7 hours. Now, listen, we were young. We had nothing else to do. Well, we could have done other stuff.
I don't think we played the way we were supposed to.
Oh, probably, clearly not.
We were only supposed to have like 2 or 3 members, I think, of X-Men on your team, and we would just keep recruiting more X-Men. So, like, some of us would have like 7 guys on our team. And
wicked marathons.
It was nutty.
That's another time.
I love that game. Actually, it's funny. I was actually looking for that game on eBay recently, too.
Oh, were you? Well, with that, I think we're going to start to wrap it up for this week, which was Marvel.
Wait. We didn't talk about any superhero games on the Virtual Boy. Oh, wait, there were none.
We were almost at the end of the show. All right. Well, with that being said, next week we'll talk about DC, see how they fare against Marvel. With that, folks, hopefully you have some ideas, and hopefully you enjoyed your Marvel games. Larry here, more 365.
And Anthony here, and just really quickly, thank you, Frankie Messina, for the suggestion. It was an awesome topic. If anybody else has any suggestions, feel free to throw it up on our Facebook page.
Yes, totally. And Frankie, you're getting 2 episodes out of this one, so congratulations. All right, folks, we're going to catch you next time. See you later.
Later.